thank you to Health Samurai. I appreciate it. And Nikolai, I have very fond memories of ice skating with you, playing hockey against those Dutch boys in the dev days in Amsterdam. So good to see you again. So I and my colleague Chris Moselle are both from MITRE. MITRE is a unusual company. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but it's a not-for-profit in the US that works for the US government for the most part, but we also do public-private partnerships, and we work in a very mission-driven way for the health and safety of US residents. So of course, we're also concerned with those overseas. So a lot of us are very mission driven, and FHIR and interoperability is very important to the future of the healthcare system, we believe. So we've contributed over the last at least 10, 12 years to the whole subject of digitization of the health infrastructure. So FHIR Shorthand is one small piece of that. What I'm going to do is talk through what FHIR Shorthand is. We call it FSH for short, FSH. Going to talk about the language itself and how you author with it, then how you build an IG. I'll hand it over to Chris. Chris is our lead developer, and he'll do some demos of how you build an IG from start to finish with FHIR Shorthand. So since we're short on time, let me push forward. Go ahead. So we're already on the background. So let me give you a little bit of background. I mean, the good news is that we have many, as a community, we have many different ways to do profiling. And you can pick a tool that suits your needs and your skills and your aesthetics. So I think in the beginning, all we had was hand editing of structured definitions and value set resources and code system resources. So fortunately, Lantana came along and created Trifolia. Forge is a product from our friends at Firely, who run the Dev Days meetings. And I consider those to be kind of guided ways to create profiles. So they're very good if you like, interacting with a tool in that way. What I'm going to talk about is, I would call it command-driven. It all originated from kind of frustration with the spreadsheet methodology, which was how we were doing things, 5 years ago. That's since denigrated or deprecated, and it was very difficult, very not obvious. So I just really wanted to say what I wanted to say, constrain this cardinality to 0, 1 or 1, 1, and make it happen. So I talked to Chris and he made it happen. So thank you to Chris for making my dreams come true. So I'll explain, about how this works in a minute, but briefly, FHIR Shorthand is a domain-specific language. It's designed for saying the things you need to say when you do profiling. And since it's designed for purpose, it's concise, it's readable, and it's understandable. So you can pretty much look at a little bit of FHIR Shorthand and get even if you don't know the language, you can get the idea of what it's trying to do. The other thing about having it as a language is that global changes and finding stuff is really easy because you load it up in a development environment. We use Visual Studio Code mostly, but you could use Notepad++ or whatever. And you can search for stuff. You can replace, if you want to rename something, you just do a global replace. It's very easy. The other benefit of text is that it's really ideal for source code control. So you can put it under GitHub, and then it takes care of all the versioning. You can branch off, you can do some development, you can remerge it, you can do PR, pull requests, you can different branches or forks. And it's great for cooperative development. In fact, this is an open source tool, it's free, and we've had contributions from the outside. In fact, thank you, Rick Geimer has made a few contributions. I appreciate that, Rick. And we've recently had contributions from Athena Health, who gave us a developer for a couple of months full time to do a new feature which allows you to do logical models in FHIR Shorthand. So it's kind of a coding, compiling, and output kind of paradigm. And the compiler does a lot of error checking. It also applies some best practices, so you get structured definitions out that do things sort of the mainline best practice way. FSH does everything that you can do if you are manually editing. So it does profiles and extensions and value sets, code systems, and variance mappings. And now it does also resources and logical models. The last thing I want to say that's important is that it's the language itself we've introduced as a standard through HL7. And it's integrated with the FHIR IG publisher so that when you run the publisher, it detects if your project has FSH files, and it'll just incorporate them into the IG. And you'll see that when Chris is working, does his demo. Next slide. So it's turned out that this has been pretty popular. I don't know whether we're bigger, smaller, or equal to Lantana. It really doesn't matter. But we've had a lot of downloads of our software. You can see here the trends of downloads per week. You know, this doesn't mean we have 45,000 users. It just means that when we have a new version, people download the software or experiment with it. But it seems to be quite popular. Next slide. And next slide, please. Yeah, so we also have this tool called FSH Finder, which goes around and crawls through GitHub and finds projects that are using FHIR Shorthand. And there's quite a number of them. We just got up to about 140. This is a little bit older. And they're all over the world. There are people developing IGs, New Zealand, Switzerland, Belgium, Denmark, etc. WHO, the Da Vinci Accelerator. We've done COVID-oriented IGs with Saner and Logica. Blue Button, which is something in the US that helps consumers download their software. And recently we've done a vaccine credential IG, which gives a QR code on your phone that shows that you've been vaccinated. So it's only been out for a little bit over a year, probably 15 months now. And the uptake has been really good. So I think we've hit a nerve, or we found something where people really enjoy using it, and we try and make it fun. There's an active discussion groups on Zulip and all that. So it's kind of a nice community. Next slide, please. So let me dive into what this language looks like. And again, I'm going to show you some syntax. I'm going to use a coding playground that we've put together, which is under fishschool.org. So if you go to fishschool.org and you click on Play with Fish, you'll get to our fish code playground. And this is not how you would necessarily do a full-scale application of FHIR Shorthand, but it allows you to get comfortable with the language. It also allows you to share examples with others for the purposes of teaching or the purposes of debugging. And in fact, I'm going to give you a URL here, bit.ly 3Y capital P capital A H 35. That encompasses an example that I'm going to do. And if you type in the 3Y capital P capital A H 35, you'll load up our coding playground, which we affectionately call FSH Online. So I'm going to do this intuitively because there's too much in the language to go through in 30 minutes. But this is how you would begin to do a profile. Here we're profiling condition, and I'll use a fake COVID-19 example. Everyone has to do a COVID-19 example now. So we'll do reporting a COVID diagnosis. So we start with a keyword. So you open up your favorite text editor first. In this case, we're in the code playground. You type in a keyword, profile, and you name your profile, in this case, COVID diagnosis. And every profile inherits from a parent. In this case, we're just inheriting from condition, but FHIR Shorthand allows you to inherit from other IGs. So you could build on US core or New Zealand core or Australia core, whatever you like. And then you can specify a description field. So here it's how to report COVID. Now, following that, there's a set of rules. So when you see these asterisks, it's like a list of rules. It's just sort of like markdown rules, kind of. We're assigning a code. So the code attribute of the condition, we're assigning to ICD-10, and the code is U07.1. And you'll see this funny $sign, and then down at the last line of this example, you see that that's an alias. So that's optional, but to avoid writing out that long URL, we assign this alias, and we can use it many times throughout the source code. The second line, we're binding a value set to severity. So COVID severities, we won't use the default, but we'll create our own value set, which I'll define in the next slide, the COVID severity value set, and we'll make it required. The next, we'll restrict the subject to a reference to a patient using a rule involving the word only. And you see the highlighting here comes from the coding playground. You can also do this on the desktop because we have a plugin for VS Code that will highlight the special characters or the special keywords within your fish. And finally, we are going to take subject and make it required. So 1.1, and you'll recognize this from the way that FHIR presents the cardinality within a IG. So now we've defined a profile. And there's actually a pattern here where every item, and you can do code systems and extensions and all those things on the left, I won't recite them, all follow a pattern of having a declaration first, then a set of keywords, and then a set of rules. So if you just keep that in mind, that's the anatomy of any fish item. And the set of keywords that follow the declaration, and to some extent the set of rules you can use, depends on what you're defining. Next slide, please. So let's go and define this value set, the severity value set. When you look at FHIR, it actually has a value set called condition severity, and it has severe, moderate, and mild. But let's suppose we want to add something called life-threatening, because if you're on a ventilator, that might be the way that that's reported as even more than severe. So we start with a keyword value set. We give it a name, COVID severity VS, a description, and then we have a statement in our language that goes include codes from value set. We give the name of that value set, the URL of that value set. And we're going to add another code. So we say include, there's an alias for SNOMED, and then code 442452003, which is life-threatening severity. So there we're done with actually defining that value set in 4 lines plus that alias, and the alias is something that's optional. That's pretty simple, but you have to know, you have to get comfortable with the syntax here, because off the top of your head, you'd never guess, that's the syntax. What's very interesting about the playground is that you can find some examples that show you how to do things. And also, if you go to Fish Finder, you can go to any one of those GitHub repositories and you can see how other people have done things. And if there are 100 plus projects, you can pretty much find anything. Next slide. Thanks, Chris. So Next thing you want to do is create an example of your profile. As Rick said, this is required by HL7, so otherwise the publisher complains. So you use a keyword instance. So here's our diagnosis example. It's an instance of that profile we just wrote, the COVID diagnosis. The subject, we're going to reference another instance, Jane Doe. We're going to set the code to the appropriate code for COVID. And we'll set the severity in the case of Jane Doe. She's serious, but she doesn't have life-threatening COVID. And of course, we need to make Jane Doe herself. It's an instance of patient, and we'll just give her a family name and a given name for now and call it quits. So next slide. So now if we're in this code playground, FSH Online, we can just hit that. So the code that we wrote is on the left. If you haven't loaded it, that's what it looks like when it's on the left. And then you click that convert to JSON button, and boom, on the right-hand side, then you'll see the resulting JSON structured definitions, value sets, and instances. And they're actually in different windows, and far right, you can click on those to see the generated JSON. So that gives you an idea of what pops out of the FSH language. And if there are any errors, you can see at the very bottom here, it says console success. It'll give you a red X down at the bottom if there's any errors, and it'll point to the line which it's questioning. Next slide. The other thing, and I've mentioned this briefly, is that there's a new button that's just been added, which you can see at the top left, FSH examples. And it gives you some examples of how to do things. And you can see all the different, the sort of menu there. It pops up a dialog, and you can clip that text out and use it as sort of your seed for building up your own FHIR shorthand. So we hope that that's a great on-ramp for you to begin to use use FHIR shorthand. We also have documentation that has a tutorial that's really worth doing, and we'll show you that at the very end when we point to the resources. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to take you through a demo.
All right,
Chris,
great.
Over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name is Chris Moselle. I'm a software engineer at the MITRE Corporation, and I'm just going to quickly walk you through how do we actually take what Mark just taught us about the FHIR shorthand language and use it to actually create an implementation guide. How do we get down to the practical bits that are required? So there's basically 6 steps, and I'm going to walk you through these steps one by one. The first step is to install Sushi. So Sushi is a compiler that can take that FHIR shorthand language and compile it down to formal FHIR structure definitions and other FHIR resources. Sushi is actually a self-referential acronym. It stands for Sushi Unshortens Shorthand Inputs. And if I recall, I think Rick Geimer may have been the one who actually came up with that acronym. If he's not, I've been giving him credit for a while. Yes, I thought so. So
I remember that meeting.
Yeah, cheers to Rick, because we love it. But Sushi is based on Node.js, and so you need to install Node in order for this to work. But after that, you can install it very simply by saying npm install -g FSH Sushi. If you have any questions or need more help, you can check out FSH School, and there's some documentation there. As Mark mentioned, we also have Visual Studio Code and a particular plugin for that adds syntax highlighting and some other features that I'll show you too. So that's also a highly recommended component. And now let's actually just jump right into some demo where I'll show you the rest. There are slides that also reflect what I'm going through in the demo if you just look at the slides later on. But we're going to be doing everything here live now. So when you want to create a Sushi project, one way you can do it is by using Sushi init. And what that's going to do is set up a baseline project for you. It'll ask you a few questions like, what do you actually want to make your project about? So we can say like, okay, this is our COVID IG. And we can say our ID for our project is FHIR.COVID. Our canonical is, well, I'm just going to accept the default for now because it takes time. Default status, default version, and then it just says, okay, do you want me to create this thing? And we'll say, yes, please do. So we'll go into the folder that it just created for us, and let's take a look at what we have there. I'm going to open Visual Studio Code to actually look at this project. I'll bump up the font just a little bit. On the left-hand side, you can see this is the project that was just created by Sushi. It has some scripts for running the IG publisher. It has a gitignore file if you're going to be using GitHub with this, an IG INI file, which is required by the IG publisher, and a configuration file. So if we look at this configuration file, this uses YAML to be able to provide your configuration information. It contains a lot of the info we entered as we were doing the Sushi initialize process. There are some other things. If you go to Fish School, there's actually documentation about all of the different parameters that you can define here, including things like dependencies on other IGs and things like that. And we also have a way to define your menu system down here as well. So that was generated for us. What was also generated for us was this file here called patient.fish. This is a very simple file, just so there's something there, but ideally, you would probably get rid of this and start writing your own thing. You might want to name your file something else. You can split up fish definitions over multiple files, put them in nested folders. You can organize it however you want. One of the features that we have in VS Code is what we call snippets. Actually, VS Code calls them snippets. And if I start writing a few letters of a keyword like profile, you can see that this thing popped up, and I can click enter, and it fills out some of the templating information that we need when we are writing a profile. I can actually do something like, my condition profile, and you can see as I'm doing that, it's actually filling out other fields too. When I hit tab, it's actually going to apply some best practices there, and it's going to convert my ID to all lowercase, use dashes between words. It's going to create a title for me that has spaces and is human readable. So that makes it a little bit quicker for me. I can say this is going to be based on condition. I could put in a description if I wanted to, and then I can get down to the rules. So kind of a nice little feature, and it's all the major FHIR Shorthand entities are supported in this way. Another thing I'll show you is when I am actually defining something like a profile on condition, it's really helpful to see what is the definition of condition in FHIR. So I can right click on this, say open FHIR documentation. It's going to open up my browser to the condition resource. So now I can kind of look at this and use that as I write out my rules, and it can be very helpful. But what we're going to do now is we're actually going to follow that same example that Mark was using, and we're just going to put that information in here. So here's our COVID diagnosis, and I'll show you one other feature that is in here is if you right click on a word that you've defined in your FHIR Shorthand somewhere else in the project, either in this file or in another file, you can say go to definition, and it'll automatically scroll to the definition of that item. So that can be very helpful for quickly navigating between things. And you can also hold down a key. On Apple, it's the Command key. On Windows, it's something else. But if you hold it down and hover, it also shows you just a brief glimpse of what you're looking at, which can also be helpful as you're authoring. So now we have our IG. That's it. We actually have an IG that's ready to be published. So we can go over here, and I'm going to just run Sushi on this folder, and it's going to run through those definitions, compile them. If I had any errors, it would report them, but luckily everything turned green. We can see that we've generated a profile, an extension, a couple value sets, a couple instances, and we also get this nice fish pun. Cool and so sophisticated. Every time you actually run Sushi, it's going to give you a random pun, and the pun will be based on how many errors or warnings you have. So we get nice happy puns when things are happy, and we get darker puns when things are not so happy. So now that we have done that, we actually can go ahead and run the publisher. Usually I'd run a script that would download the publisher, but we actually, that takes time. So I'm just gonna copy the publisher here. Oh, actually I need to make a directory called input cache. And this is actually defined by the IG publishing framework where a lot of these things go. And I'm going to copy the publisher jar to input cache. And now I'm going to run the gen once script. And this is actually running the IG publisher on what we just created. So we're going from scratch to an IG here. And as Rick showed in his demonstration, this takes a little time, but it's generally, if you have a smaller IG like this, you're talking about a minute or less. So I think this should be ready in just a minute here. Creating the HTML, and there, it's done. So now we can open the generated index file that it created, and we have our IG. We're using the base template here, but you can specify what template you want in your IG INI file. And we can go to our artifact listing here, and I'll make this bigger, but we can see those things that we defined in FHIR Shorthand. We can click on that. We see our differential. We see our snapshot. So you can see we went from scratch to having this full IG pretty quickly. And really, this is the only code that we actually had to write here. And you can see, as Mark showed you, it's pretty straightforward and declarative regarding what you're doing. So that's pretty neat. So I'm going to go back to my slides here for a minute and jump through those things we just demoed. At this point, you can add more fish. You can add some narrative content so that you can actually have your IG looking like a real IG with pages and descriptions on the individual resource pages and things like that. You can customize your menus. You can create a GitHub repository and share this with other people. So this is basically how you can start from scratch. But what if there is some existing FHIR that you're interested in, and do you want to see how would that look like using FHIR Shorthand? Well, good news, there are ways to do that as well. And we're going to go back to FSH Online here. And you'll notice that there is a left-hand side and a right-hand side. I'm going to just reload this from scratch so that they're both blank. And here is a structure definition for, here's the body height profile from FHIR R4. If I click on JSON, I can actually see the JSON structure definition representation. I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to bring it over here in FSH Online. So here we have our structure definition, and you can see there's quite a long differential here that describes the body height structure definition profile. I can click on Convert to Fish. And over here, we got out the FHIR Shorthand. Now you'll notice this is fairly wordy. Part of that is because of the way that this particular profile is built. We do have a number of extensions that we are looking at. We do have some slicing. And then the way that they happened to fix the codes, they went through a fairly verbose approach to doing that. I would actually use a pattern, which would actually reduce all of these lines into just one line of code. But this is actually representing the profile exactly as it was in the structure definition, only using FHIR Shorthand to do it. And there are a few things here that you haven't seen before that I'll just quickly call out. One is this index format. We use something called soft indexing. And what it is you can use numeric indexes when you're talking about items in a list, but sometimes that can get a little cumbersome. So often we'll just start a list with 0 and then use equal to say use the same index as the last one, or plus to say increment the index from the last one. So here we've got 0, 0. This is 1, 1. We increment again. So this would be 2, 2, etc. Another thing that you see here is all of these start with a caret sign. So for example, publisher, this is how we can directly set information in the structure definition resource itself. So structure definition resource defines an element called publisher. This is how we can get at that publisher element to directly set it. So of course, we can go ahead and round trip this, and it's going to take this FHIR Shorthand and it's going to create this over here. Now, what if I wanted to do that actually in aggregate over an entire IG? Well, you can also do that, and I'm not going to show you exactly how that works, but we have this thing called GoFSH, and with GoFSH, you can download an existing IG, you can expand usually it's like a tarball or a zip, you expand it, and then you run GoFSH on it, and it will actually try to convert the whole IG into FHIR Shorthand resources. And I have done that with US Core, and I can just quickly show you what that looks like. Let me go back one directory. So this is US Core. There are multiple ways you can tell GoFSH to format the output. I have it formatting by type, and so all the profiles are in one page, but you can see here, just go to the top. Here's our profile for US Core Pediatric Head Occipitable Frontal Circumference Percentile Profile. I think I saw Eric on the call. Thank you very much, Eric, for this profile name. I really appreciate it. It makes all of my presentations just like 5 seconds longer than they probably needed to be. But anyway, so we have this profile, and again, it's a parent of US Core, and if I wanted to see, oh, what is that definition, I can say go to definition, and here's the US Core Vital Signs profile as well. So a way to jumpstart your IG using FHIR Shorthand if you have an existing one. So we very quickly took you through some of the tools: Sushi, GoFSH, VS Code, FSH Online. Mark showed you Fish Finder, and then Fish School is where you can go to find out information about all of these things. The FHIR Shorthand is an HL7 specification. You can actually go to the language reference, and we have a URL here that goes to the latest build, which has some of the newer FHIR Shorthand features we've been working on. We also have a quick reference card that you can use, and this hasn't been updated for Shorthand STU2 yet, because that hasn't even validated, but this has all the FHIR Shorthand 1.0 stuff in it as well. We have a set of relevant links that you can take a look at later if you'd like, and I think that's it. So we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mark. Please, everyone, be more active. So we have the first question from Nikolai. So can fish be used to define basic FHIR profiles or custom resources? Did you think about this?
Yes, so FHIR Shorthand can be used to do profiles on basic. You certainly can do that, and when you profile basic, you're primarily working with extensions, but we did try to make extensions so that they're pretty easy to use and fairly straightforward. But you can also, as of maybe a month ago, we do now support creating custom resources. So you can create resources that have first-class elements that are brand new, and that works as well. There are some caveats there as far as the rest of the FHIR tooling goes. The IG publisher and a lot of the other FHIR tooling really is built around the concept that only HL7 creates resources. And so if you try to use custom resources with a lot of that tooling, it won't work, but we will actually generate the structure definitions for those custom resources for you. So if you have your own internal kind of ecosystem or framework that knows how to work with your custom resources, then you can use FHIR Shorthand to define them. And that's in the that's supported in the Sushi 2.0 beta release. It's not in the official release yet, but we expect to release that as an official release in the next week or two.
Thank you. More questions? Anyone?
Yeah, I can ask this way. I think it's simpler. Right?
Thank
you. Amazing. Yeah, I remember just like 1 year and we have an amazing tool. Do you have any syntax completion and checks on Visual Code? Like I start typing some keyword and it autocomplete, or if I mistyped, it will show me error in Visual Code? Or...
Right. We don't have that yet. That is something we would like to build. Certainly, once you start typing and you, for example, declare who your parent is on a profile, then we'd love to be able to have it so that when you're writing your rules, it will actually tell you, these are the valid elements in that profile. So for example, if I have done something like observation, then when I go to write my rules, if I start typing C, it might say, give me a choice between code and, some other element that starts with C. So we want to support those sorts of things. Yeah, in component, yeah. So we want to support those things. They're not there yet, but certainly VS Code obviously has what's needed to be able to make that happen. We just haven't gotten around to it yet. And the same thing for being able to provide some error checking and like underline something that's wrong. We'd like to do that too. There are some more limitations regarding exactly how much we can do there and still remain performant, but I think we can do some things there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any way to add some extensions to Sushi, like marker or something like this? So if I don't want to kind of print the same pattern again and again, so can I add the new rules to the Sushi?
Yeah, so one of the features that we didn't have time to go into is sort of like a macro. We call it Rulesets. And Rulesets enable you to, if I understand your question correctly, so there are repeated needs to repeat some statements, and sometimes the statements you need to repeat, they're the same except for some argument, like the name or. So we have this very powerful feature where you can define this sort of macro, which expands into a set of rules that can be specialized to where you're inserting them. So I think, let's see, Chris is showing the example for a capability statement. And capability statements, you can spend a long time writing because they are long, they can be lengthy. So here is a set of rules that says, one rule set says support resource, and it has an argument resource and expectation. The expectation is should, shall, or must. And so you can just say support in your definition of the profile for the capability statement. It's not a profile, it's an instance. You just say support this resource, support this profile, support this interaction, support this search parameter, and it becomes much more readable than before and truly lives up to the shorthand part of FHIR Shorthand, because you're saving many statements that you'd have to write if you were doing it in JSON or in XML. It's a feature that I love to use, and I use it a lot. And it's a more recent feature, so not everyone that's using shorthand is doing it, but it's one of the most powerful things actually in FHIR Shorthand.
Thank you.
There is a question from YouTube chat. Ilya Beda is asking, why do you end up with custom syntax and language? You may use some data DSL, something like a more simple version of structure definition resource.
So, it's interesting because we looked for a long time at YAML, and why did we actually come up with the DSL of our own? Could you just define your profile in some sort of declarative way? And I think you could do that. We did do a pretty thorough evaluation of alternatives, and it turned out that FHIR is different enough, I guess, where it just made sense to create this language that was more directly readable and resonated with FHIR users. I remember having quite a long discussion with Eric Haas, for example. He's a primary author of US Core about this very subject. And if it's not your your cup of tea, then you can decide to go a different way. And I think Rick has shown a very viable methodology of using Lantana. But there's a certain type of person that's very comfortable with learning this kind of language, and I think it applies pretty well.
Yeah, Mark, this is Rick. I hope you don't mind if I chime in here. As I've had conversations with you before, I like our Lantana tooling. I like the GUI because I think it's useful for people who don't have that coding mindset, but myself, I do. So sometimes I find our own tool somewhat hindersome because I want to be able to export everything, edit the text, and then put it back in and use it more of as an organizing principle. So I really love FHIR Shorthand. I think you did pick the right syntax. I'm not a fan of YAML for something like this. I think you made the right choice.
Thank you. Very kind.
So this is kind of markdown for the FHIR. Yes?
I noticed some questions about CQL, and I've got to give that over to Chris because he's one of the primary authors of CQL.
Okay.
Are you looking at chat?
I can be.
I'll read it to you. Let's see. What about CQL engine? Is it able to evaluate custom resources?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So CQL execution and CQL FHIR exec. Yeah, I'm also one of the primary developers of those open source CQL execution engines. And the short answer is it depends. So CQL is defined to be data model agnostic, and so you can hook up any data model to CQL. Most of us are using FHIR with CQL, and there are formally defined FHIR data models for CQL. They're defined in files called model info files. And those model info files define the full set of all FHIR types that comprise FHIR, right? So if you wanted to use CQL with custom resources, you would actually need to create your own extended data model that maybe includes the FHIR stuff, but also includes all of your custom resources, and those would have to be represented in this special model info format in order for CQL to FHIR CQL to ELM, the translator, to be able to translate them properly. And then in order for CQL execution to be able to actually execute on them, you would also need to update CQL FHIR exec so that it uses those FHIR model info files as well. So there's some additional things that you need to do, but the overall framework and architecture for CQL execution and CQL exec FHIR do allow for it.
Yeah, I think, by the way, Chris has made such a huge contribution. I have to pat him on the back for being the genius behind both the, well, at least half the genius. Bryn Rhodes, has done a great deal of work on CQL, but with CQL and FHIR Shorthand, Chris has really distinguished himself in this community. And again, these are all open source and free. So that's another thing that, we can always take contributions from the outside, and we're very, very happy as working in the public interest to provide these tools free of charge.
Yeah, I think this is very well in line with FHIR itself, and we have seen 3 solutions today, and all of them are open source. That's very exciting.